Hello, everyone. I think we are ready to start. So it's an honor to introduce Catie Newell to this evening's Fariba Tehrani lecture series titled Architecture and Loss. Catie Newell develops material and optical assemblies that amplify our connection to a living and spinning Earth. As the founding principle of the architecture and research practice called Alibi Studio, and as an associate professor of architecture at the University of Michigan, Taubman College, Newell's research and creative practice has been widely recognized for exploring design constructions and materiality in relationship to location and geography. The work ranges in scale from building to product that explores the world through material systems and optical captures. Alibi Studio deploys material explorations, illumination and darkness, and novel techniques and methods of construction through rigorous prototyping and custom fabrication tools. The process of fabrication is instrumental and a vital act of the work, often amplifying material effects and situational influences, intertwining the processes of making and design across the entire project. Her work has been widely published and exhibited throughout the world, in venues in Detroit, in the Arsenale at the Venice Biennale, in night-sensitive environments, in museum solo shows, and the landscapes of rural Michigan. Newell is a Lucas Fellow, a Kresge Artist Fellow, a Civitella Fellow, and a Fellow of the American Academy of Rome. We first met in first year a few years ago, actually, when you critiqued our fabrication methods as part of that program, and it's such a pleasure and honor to have you here with us tonight. So with that, I'll just pass it over to Catie. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's truly an honor to be here presenting the work, some old work, some new work, also presenting to old friends and new friends. And sharing through the idea of architecture and loss some of the spaces that I'd like to honor. I know this community has also recently faced some loss, so I come with a very open heart and a lot of respect for that, and hope that conversations that can arise out of some of these works speaks to some of that feeling. I think it's also fitting to be here on Halloween. A lot of my work, I think, is often discussed in ways of thinking about things that are very ephemeral or spirits, ghosts, and working with things that may have transitions in their own space and time and overlapping stories that are happening. So I'm going to jump in and talk about a lot of projects, but maybe some of the first things to just mention underlying a lot of my work. I think for a long time, of the suite of work that I'm going to be showing, I think it's fair to say that I've operated in consideration of light and darkness actually being the main occupant of the space. And to that end, that means that there's a lot of work in terms of thinking about how to draw with materials or make or erase space in that manner, how to think about watching for the unexpected. And then something that I think is really important to Alibi Studio is a lot of the work that we do within existing spaces. We take a lot of care for thinking about caring and tending to for also thinking about sort of long lineage or memory that might already be there, and seeing that as a kind of launching point to make things that maybe wouldn't have been thought of if they started from the beginning, or things that we continue on to sort of add to their story and go from there. So I'm actually going to start with a project that I think maybe has the sort of sense of discussing about the loss of a space. This work, Second Story, if we were to zoom back and give it a kind of simple definition, it's a way of casting and relocating a space that was under threat of demolition. In essence, trying to keep or even maybe enact the demolition so that the actual space would remain. It was made based on, or with, I should say, this house in Flint, Michigan. This is a historic house. It's actually a duplex that became a duplex funeral home as part of their Carriage Town neighborhood. And the house anchored a really strong corner, and its massing was quite important to the feel of just having arrived to that neighborhood. And I was initially brought in on the project actually just in the sense of the architectural credentials to help them evaluate the roof, how bad one of the floor systems was, and to work with those that were giving it an effort to try to turn it into a community art center. All at the same time, the city was asking for its demolishing. And so a little bit of the ask, based on another work that I'll show as well, was with the ambition of asking if I could do something that would give this space some attention, maybe delay the request for the demolishing. So I actually started to work with the space. The interest came in a way of sort of cloaking or ghosting that space. I had at the same time a request to do an exhibition in Chicago in an empty gallery, and actually was really struggling with trying to figure out what I would do in an empty space. And these projects came together. So I pulled and worked on the exterior of part of the second story, part of the naming, to, in essence, trace and cast or cloak that portion of both the exterior as well as the interior. And you'll see that there's some real fine pulls. This is acrylic rod. It was chosen in particular to be transparent. I wasn't so much interested in necessarily bringing what might be the exact materials there, the coloration, but instead literally bringing the volume and a little bit of the sort of space around that. So by casting the exterior and the interior, what I then did was move that skinning to the exhibition space. And you can imagine, of course, if you do the inside and the outside, one important thing that's left is the cavity of that wall and that sort of empty space that we actually can't see or even inhabit or experience. And so part of the translation to the other space was to not translate it perfectly. So if I were to move it and then, sorry, it's hard to see this. If these are the walls looking in plan, and what I ended up doing was actually sort of splaying them open with an interest of trying to create spaces that didn't even exist in the original house, so to be occupied differently. So in this case, with that splaying of that void, I was able to create a new room that, of course, does not exist in the original building, but became a new occupation. The previous slide also gives us a sense. We called this area the sillway, so it was really the casting of the windowsill. In its movement to the gallery, it's expanded out, so it actually becomes a space. And then the third sort of new space around it was to bring what was a second story down to a first floor. This is a first floor gallery. And what happens in that sort of suspension of the work, so the work is suspended from the ceiling, the only things that are able to touch the ground in its sort of way of feeling very delicate and vulnerable is the shadows and anyone that's visiting that space. This gives you a little sense of some of the detailing. The angles were made from working just to amplify the angles that were already in the roof line, and then literally drawing around through the space, trying to understand to what extent being able to capture that volume. I think one thing that you'll see, and it'll show up in a couple other projects, is we have a strong interest and also in the sort of making or transposing of these forms, that moment when it becomes recognizable in a different way. And so for some of the viewpoints, you end up being able to see that distinction of what makes the recognition to the original house. In other views, for example, this angle, it starts to dissolve. It starts to become more atmospheric and more cloud-like, allowing it to become something else from different vantage points. And you'll see this occur in a few other projects. The project actually also then had an interesting story when it ties back to the demolition or the requested demolition of the house. The gallery that we were in only had doors the size of our kind of normal human body doors, about 2'6". So the piece couldn't actually come in full. It had to be, in essence, finished and solidified within that space. Interestingly, within that story, the gallery was sort of a sublet to a sublet, and the initial sublet was evicted during the time of the show. And so we received a call that we had to very quickly come and remove the piece, which meant, in a way, to literally sort of demolish it and take it apart. And I didn't actually feel that this project was done yet. We also had to do this in a hurry because we were moving on we were moving to another project that needed, that was abroad. So it came down to someone saying, you know, you have a month to get rid of this, and I actually had about 4 days to get rid of it. So we went over there, we took it apart, and in the sort of like rush of taking it apart, all we could do was put it into a storage unit, and we recognized that we were breaking the piece, it was falling apart, and so it's sort of the last thing we did was to actually put it back together in that storage unit, and try to document it as a way to also add to the story that if second story, meaning the installation, is the piece that's demolished, perhaps that story can help with the house not being demolished. And thankfully, I'm happy to report that ultimately the original house has been transitioned into a community center and remains standing to this day, and that only this work, this second story, is all that was lost in that process. The next set that I want to talk about is a work called Overnight. Overnight is actually both an installation and a set of photography, a set of photographic works that are called Nightly. These two pieces went together, and its effort is actually archiving something that was going to be lost in the landscape of Detroit. And so the work, I'd say, started out with an investigation of a pretty key moment. A handful of years ago, the city of Detroit was changing out the streetlights from being sodium vapor lamps that were wired by copper to very bright LED lights that were going to be wired by aluminum. And one thing that I was actually quite interested in was the capturing of these spaces that were going to no longer be present. There was a lot of darkness in Detroit at that moment. The infrastructure is getting changed out because a lot of it had been lost and not tended to. Materials had been scrapped or just not replaced as they were needing service. And so what I was finding, and almost in a sense of trying to capture that moment, I started to run ahead of the Public Lighting Authority to archive the spaces that would soon be lost with that more gentle lighting and even the pockets of darkness that were among it. So the series Nightly, which is building off of some nighttime photography work that I had been slowly building, was trying to capture the spaces and actually working very carefully to use them as a study for architectural spaces and the interest in what happens or what can happen when we believe what might be there in the night or what might be gone. It turns out in a lot of our thinking that the darkness adds a lot of really interesting aspects to architectural spaces where color often changes greatly, foreground and background might shift and change. Spaces may be entirely erased or implied in their own sort of vanishing, and there's in essence a different feel and even a different kind of physical capacity that's not something we experience when we're in these spaces by day. And so this work came as an archive, as a mourning, as a sense of loss for these spaces that I felt to be quite powerful and would soon, in essence, be taken away by the strong illumination. So the installation that paired with these worked very carefully with the materials that were present or that would be present. I ended up drawing, we do a lot of work where we're feeling like we're drawing in space. We're literally drawing lines out of the materials that are present. This one was created with the basis of being very, very thin aluminum gauged wire. Because the city was switching from copper wiring to aluminum, primarily at that time, of course, copper was a more valuable metal than aluminum. So it was a cost choice and also a choice in terms of upkeep and avoiding the sort of changeovers that happen from things like scrapping, for example. And so we started to make a lot of lines by working with that aluminum and highlighting the inefficiency that aluminum brings to the system. So we ended up coiling aluminum very, very tightly, in essence making it longer and longer and longer, and then pulling it to have different textures that would themselves be able to sum together into a more kind of atmospheric space. There were long lines of the aluminum, and then they had very kind of fine rods that were ending them, and at the very ends of the tips, we actually had really tiny LED lights. They don't photograph well, they're so small, but so a lot of the aluminum is electrified, and you can see up in the corner, maybe with the contrast of the screen, it's a little bit hard, but the copper line, fine copper line, is what is suspending the aluminum in the air. And the forms that we started creating were actually things that we began to see within the photographs. So the sort of implications or small little notes of a piece of architecture. How much is one, questioning how much does one need to recognize to either believe in the space or infill that space. So we started to make, in essence, the silhouettes of two homes in a varied translation of that. And it came from a couple of key photographs that were also on the wall. You'll see in this photograph, there's a key moment, of course, where you're seeing just the peak of that house. And that gives you enough, and the sort of trust in that space gives you enough to infill the rest of that house as well. This photograph also becomes very key and works a little bit with what I was mentioning with second story as well. Just getting a small highlight of part of a tree, turning that into being a pairing of both a tree and, let's say, a more atmospheric cloud, the kind of ability for it to dissolve or float on its own because you can't see the rest of it. So those details started to play out, again, with trying to figure out what we can get in the sort of summation of drawing with lots of lines. You can see here a little bit of the hints of the very tiny LED lights that were there. But one thing that we actually cared for greatly was as well as the appearance of this work by its own day and night. So the gallery space that this was in was a square in plan. On entry, you're facing two opposite corners, which are both floor-to-ceiling windows, all the way across those angles of the wall. So on entry to this space, it's really difficult to see the installation. Most people would walk in and see that flanked on the opposite walls were the photographs and to begin to experience those. And it wasn't until you walked around the space and you had the backdrop of the dark walls that were hosting the photographs that you were able to see what work was there. And we played off of this. This is in essence the daytime view. At night, what we did was to light them as well with high-graze lighting that was calling forward the strong LEDs that were going to soon be illuminating the city of Detroit. And that lighting, and thankfully this space also being on the ground floor, the gallery was not open at night. So the experience of seeing these pieces actually became something where you would see it from the exterior. And a sort of beautiful element to this came about during the installation. We were working deep into the night and seeing how it could be illuminated, and we were actually able to work with the security guards who first noticed how strong you were able to see the lights from further back, basically see the overnight piece, even from the exterior. And it was with their sort of inquiry to the director of the museum that the museum agreed to turn off all of the exterior lightings during the duration of the show. And so this would illuminate from quite far away. And similar to what I was mentioning before, as you moved on angles and moved around those two flanked walls, you were able to get this more cloud-like feeling of the space, and the implications of the two homes would dissolve into a more atmospheric from different points of view. I'll also mention too, it's hard to come across in photographs, the photographs, the nightly series. They are quite rich by day in terms of how they pick up the ink work that's on them. And at night, because we did not illuminate them, they themselves would fall into darkness. So you were able to see the nighttime photos only by day, and at night those would be whisked away as well. And this relates in a way, thinking through, of a much older project. This is one that I think is quite fitting, as it centered a lot around traditions or instances that occur around Halloween. Salvage Landscape is a work we did quite some time ago. Its easiest description is to talk about it in terms of thinking about a way to curate a demolition. It's very much so about analog making and working through how to use a house that had been hit by arson to be both the palette and the formwork of something entirely new. And so this site sat across from our train station, which is undergoing some massive renovations right now, and was formulated out of the house, literally, that you see here in the foreground. I also was initially brought into this project to help think through the transformation of this house. The owners who had received this before it was hit by arson, but it was already kind of ailing from being abandoned, were desiring to take apart the house and then create an exterior sculpture garden in what remained as the foundation. So they asked me to think through and to work with some of the friends that I had in terms of being able to demolish the space, but to really think forward about how to curate the foundation space as a sculpture garden and to make the first sculpture for that space. And so I jumped aboard carefully, just working through considerations of what would be a safe demolition, how to work with that, as well as how to tend to a space that was going to be lost within the city, and a very historic home at that too. And so the initial work was literally taking apart the space and thinking through what might be appropriate to tend to or consider that space carefully. One thing that came across with that is, of course, the very deep bulbous char that comes from wood, particularly when it's not burned all the way through. It has a sort of brilliant sheen to it from different light points of view. It can be very dark, can also be very, very shiny. And I started to just work carefully collecting the wood, and it was at this moment where there was a lot of collection of the material. Some people were salvaging the bricks, salvaging the wood. It's actually all of this, even the naming salvage landscape came before the project really emerged. There's also a few key moments. You can see just some massive removal of the house and understanding the material as having been something that used to formulate a house, no longer doing that. This was a key moment actually that later played into the thinking of second story. This was when very safely portion of the floor from above was removed in effort to expose some of the second story. So you're seeing, you're standing below in the epicenter of the fire at this moment, looking up to a room now exposed to below that is part of the second floor. And then this served as actually the really key moment in the project. You see on the left the moment of almost a perfect section cut in a way through the house. The house is stabilized as best we could at this moment, and you can see in the foreground the archiving and sorting of the wood that was coming from the house. So the wood that made the back half, literally in a way, sort of half of the house, now of course in its different chars and different lengths and appearances that were coming from the fire. So looking a little bit closer, this was the moment when I recognized that the work wasn't so much in tearing down the house and then doing a new installation within the foundation. The work was actually making something out of the demolition itself. And so this was also when I recognized it was important to consider the house to be both the palette and the formwork to creating this. And so with the 3 rooms stabilized around it, started to, in essence, skin out what was this initial room in the living space and to insert the wood back inside. You can see on ends, this fire was, the fire was put out, so a lot of the wood was not entirely burnt through. So cutting on the end exposed new wood in section. Those pieces were then placed back into the space. This gives you a sense of what that looks like from the back. This is hurrying up in the process. I was interested in trying to figure out in essence, a new room or a new entry to that space. So this is facing the back side of the house. You see the sliced wood on end grain stacked to make a way. And now we'll walk through it. This is going deeper into that space. And then turning back to look around the backyard with snow starting to come into the project. And then moving through that space, so this is turning back, coming onto the edge, and then out to the side. There's another doorway as a way to sneak through and around. And then coming around to the other side, which is actually quite important to this space. because the wood had been burnt, it was much lighter, having been burnt a significant way through. And this allowed us to work with really long cantilevers, something that the stacking that we did would not be possible with the long lengths being able to hold one another. Some of our lengths were as long as 14 feet in terms of the cantilever, but because of the lightness of the work, we were able to, in essence, shove half of the house back inside of itself, making this very, very darkened interior space back into the house. The house, of course, at this time did not have any electricity, so we were working with natural light and gas-powered tools. And so the fall of the sun, the sunset every day, was a key moment that started to work carefully with the installation. This photograph actually shows the light coming through the front door, facing to the west. And it became a key moment in the installation. You can see right here, there's a little crack of light. We took that chance to open up the installation a little bit more, because what would happen every day at sunset, and it comes out differently on different projectors, but every day at sunset, the light would graze across the very charred wood and be a golden, just for about 5 minutes. And we knew this was pretty key to the project, enough to change and open it up so that it would have this graze of light during that time. And this was a rather short-lived project in terms of the active demolition that was happening. I showed this with great reflection. This was Halloween several years ago. It was key that this project, we really pushed for it to conclude on the night before Halloween, which in Detroit, thankfully many years ago, it's no longer the case, but was referred to as Devil's Night, which was a night notorious for a lot of arsons. It's now, through a lot of work within the community, it's now become Angel's Night and is no longer as much of a worry. But we were interested in bringing the installation to a pretty key moment on Devil's Night in recognition of the sort of threat of fire that the city was still facing at that time. And so, this being Halloween, the work moving forward was to then continue the demolition of the house. So the next step was the 3 rooms around salvage landscape would be demolished as well. And that's what gave us the exposure of this very dense back half of the house that we had created. It was part of our initial design. There's something we couldn't see the entire time. The work that is done in terms of what would be now the exterior of that. These would have been planks in the roof. You can see that the rafters were not burnt all the way through, and so the unburnt portions became the texture and the sort of marking, or lack of marking, let's say, on the exterior of salvage landscape, as well as you're able to see the sort of floor pattern that was left from the rest of the house that is no longer there. This gives you another vantage point, looking back on that, in terms of being able to see what we walked through in photographs before, the 2 entry points of that tight quarters there of the house. Salvage landscape then, as the rest of the house was being demolished, was relocated to be part of another exhibition. And a longer story, not for tonight, but it was literally lifted and driven across the state to a museum to be in a very small show, small meaning short in its duration. Thankfully, Salvage Landscape was actually awarded some prize money within that show, which it was seeing that it was likely going to be demolished there, just in terms of there being no funds to bring it back. But with the sort of funding award of the show, we brought it back, much to the request too of the neighborhood. And so we very carefully set it down as a way to sort of help conclude the story for it. What was happening as we were losing the houses is that we, similar in what was happening in Flint, losing the massing of that, of those city blocks. You'll see also in the meantime, when it left and came back, the house was hit by arson again. So this was part of the desire to get the work back, at least for a little while. So we very closely aligned it to the footprints of the original houses that would have been there. So that salvage landscape was, given that it was half of one of those houses, replacing that missing volume again on the block for the time being. And I'd say that a lot of the work really, salvage landscape fed greatly the next project that I'd like to show. This work, Secret Sky, is a work that we did it took us several years to complete it, but we were asked to work within a project that has the ambition to save a lot of the iconic barns that are in rural Michigan. In the thumb of Michigan, a region where a lot of wooden barns still exist, but much is getting replaced with large aluminum sheds. The barns aren't being so much used for equipment or livestock anymore. They're there in the landscape, and many of them are being left to the weather. And so there is an initiative in the thumb to pair designers and artists with barns to remake them, giving them a new life or a longer life. And so we came aboard similar to something that I think is very important in a lot of our work, and just started tending to one of the barns, working with the foundation, working with columns that needed more care, readjusting the siding, and thinking through sort of an initial proposal that we had already generated for this space. At that time, I'd say what really stood out to us was the feeling of this building as being quite large for us, but very small in the landscape that exists there. And recognizing, and this is maybe really where we started to understand that a lot of our work cares greatly for light or dark as the occupant. So I'll zoom ahead in this one to show you exactly what was the end, so it makes more sense when I tell you about the process. But we ended up making a passageway into the barn. We often refer to it quietly as the slice, although the walls are actually turning in and you can walk through this space as a form. So it's not a simple cut, and you, in essence, are walking through the barn with never being able to enter it. So we were matched with a barn that was the short face running parallel to the road. Also, I think fortuitous to us is straight on is the trees sort of blocking the short side, and then well beyond is just tended fields and a vast open sky that allows for a really, really long sunset. And working with the barn too, we also had these magical moments. For those of you that know barns quite well know that the siding is often intentionally spaced for airflow of what's in there. And so these amazing light qualities, at times I thought it might just be fine enough to invite people to come and spend a lot of time in the barn, because the sort of light lines that already existed were extremely beautiful to that space. But a lot of our time, and for a long time, matching with the tending of the work, was to also restructure the barn so it could take this light well that I have designed for it. And that meant, because in order to pull off the optical effect of what we were doing and the spatial effect, we had to cut through a pretty important beam, and we grazed right next to a column. Also kind of opening up these large new surfaces for the barn that meant exposure in a location where there's great, very high winds to the space. So a lot of restructuring. Key to the project is there's a moment in the gambrel roof where they still touch together, the two portions of the building, and then new structure that's in there. This is in essence standing in the slice and looking up, so you see that the cut actually happens in the front facade, which is on the right here for us, and then what you're seeing on the left is the cut going through the roof, and that's how it's spatially able to be made. We also, in terms of skinning it and making this a space instead of just a cut, added a lot of surface area to the barn, and so that required a lot more wood. Fortunately for collecting the wood, but unfortunately for the projects, another barn during this process that was going to be, we did the third barn in this series, the barn for the fourth barn blew down in a windstorm. And then the owner very graciously gave us the material as a way to finish the siding of of secret sky. And so all of the wood on this face is the wood on this face, and this one is from that barn, in essence allowing us to save both the barn we were working on as well as much as we could from the barn that had blown over. Much care and attention went into detailing in an effort to work seamlessly with this cut, wanting to have it present itself as something as if it had always been there. If the light and the sky had been constantly the occupants and part of the original sort of interest and necessity of the barn. So very particular and sharp soffit points and real care for figuring out, of course, how to care for the roof and the drainage and things that we were exposing to the elements at that time too. Again, this is standing in the slice and looking back up. And then this gives you a sense of a little bit of some of the shade and shadow play with the sky inward. And then this is kind of the shot that people generally see right on arrival, being able to look perfectly through that slice and seeing the landscape beyond. A bit more distance, so as entering that original driveway, this is the angle that one receives as they turn into the property. And of course, Michigan has tremendous sunsets that this is trying to record and capture, or in the smallest way, be a part of. We also took interest in seeing how to use secret sky as an experiment for what to do both day and night. And so on the roof, we installed solar panels, gathering lots of energy given their strong exposure here. And at nighttime, we were able to go after that effect that I showed you earlier on the interior, where this was something we noticed during our construction process, that if we had our bright construction lights on the inside while we were redoing the structure, that those lines of light that we cared for so much on the interior were now being exposed to the exterior and drawing these great lines across the landscape. And so while the barn also becomes a lantern at nighttime, I think what I cherish most about it is what it's doing to the landscape beyond. So this is a blurry image, but it's trying to capture those long lines going across the rest of the property and up those very tall trees, which made this beautiful drawing across the space at night. So each night, the barn, we made a sensor where it senses when sunset occurs. It waits for 45 minutes, so it goes beyond twilight into full darkness, and then the lights turn on for 2 hours and turn off also to assure that we're not adding, to late night light pollution. We did, through some funding with the Michigan Economic Cultural Council, we were able to replace the original roof of the barn. It was cedar shingles with asphalt shingles on top of it, and the wear and tear of the weather was starting to pull off all of those shingles. And so the roof, not where we sliced it, of course, but the rest of the roof really needed to be replaced. And so we got a grant to replace it this spring as a metal roof. And we had this one beautiful moment that unfortunately only 4 of us could see in person, but we ripped the roof off entirely and were able to get those lines of light, not just to expand across the landscape, but also to give us this upward image. So that was a lovely moment. We're about to actually release a video that shows more of this in celebration of that grant finishing. And then this is the kind of completing the work of the new metal roof. Thankfully, it allowed us to add things also as a gutter and some of the care, so that we are hoping that this just adds to decades and decades now of this piece existing, where many of our installations intentionally don't exist for a very long time, but this one now, the ephemerality comes from the sort of transition that's happening in the sky. And this one being, this is actually not the sun, but the chance of a moon alignment. We're often asked if there's a sort of celestial intentionality on exactly where we sliced it. It had more to do with how the foundation and the original doors were present. But for us, it reflects that moment and that sort of wish. I would say a lot of our work we want people to experience in solitude. and to sort of recognize the sort of joy and the special marker moment where they're present with the work. It will be never the same again in terms of particularly thinking about the qualities of light and darkness. I'm going to actually now walk through what we're doing currently, a project that has been an enormous slow go and has been happening during all of these works, it feels like, but has been going very slowly and now has its own sort of new stories that we're literally working with and even grappling with in some of those cases. But we're making a space called Hideout, which is intended to be my own studio within Detroit. It's actually being made, it's across from our historic Mount Elliott Cemetery. And for this image, it's in that pile of trees there. So hard to see from above, but one of the beautiful things about it is that it is entirely surrounded by trees and even the ambition of the kind of trees outside and inside. And this space, this was the old sawdust building for a lumber yard that was on the next block over. So when the scraps were collected from the lumber yard, this was used to turn into sawdust at the time that Detroit was using sawdust on the road instead of salt for ice, and kindling, of course, for fire. When we received it, and you're starting to notice the picture, it actually has no roof. Maybe calling it a building is a little misleading, and I'll explain a bit more about that too. But it had a little bit of, it still had, this is a two-story machine room that was still in the space, and then, much to my delight, the sort of existence of a lot of trees and growing in that. So similar to some of our previous works, the real first effort was just to tend to it, clean it out, replace lintels, work with it. And interestingly enough, that guided some of our first architectural maneuvers, because since there is no roof anymore, there's no lateral support. And so these long walls, the footprint is 27 feet by 80 feet. These long walls needed to have breaks in those moments. So we don't show too many of our construction drawings, but this is an important one to recognize because we worked very closely with the city. Interestingly enough, there's a technicality in the city of Detroit that if a building has no roof, it's on an emergency demo list, which means the city at any moment can demolish the building with no notice. It also means that in order to get it off of the demo list, you are supposed to, one is supposed to renovate it immediately to full occupancy. As you can imagine, there's a bunch of buildings that are undergoing creative renovation in Detroit, and in a sort of long, multi-month, maybe year process, working through the city, understanding our efforts for this building, but also those of some of our friends, we were able to actually, this is going to sound small, but it's really big in the city. We were able to get the city to finally agree to the phased setup of moving buildings that are otherwise very sort of falling out of their definition of buildings through projects for full renovation. And so Hideout was the first to get that approval and has now allowed others to be able to move in a phased condition, which is sometimes, out of necessity with either money or a creative renovation that requires something to not simply, bring it back to things we already know. And so our work, we had to add these, we added, in essence, fins or buttresses to the walls. In doing that, we made very particular cuts around trees that were already there, at moments that windows could become new doors. And as you're seeing here too, I think one of the kind of great things about this space is its openness to above. And a lot of our efforts in sort of reconstructing this, there was a kind of making and unmaking of this space, filling the cores solid as a way for them also to stand and adding a structural ring. And in all of this, you can see the sort of building coming and going, and then starting to think through what might actually be that studio space. And this is where we went off into thinking a lot about the facade, the conditions of the ambition to build a small building within the building, and working through a lot of kind of discrete ways of thinking about how to work with patterns that would disturb light in a way. I actually remember I was here for the drawing code show, and that was the original facade of this building. And I'm showing you all this because the building took a great turn right after that show when, or soon after that show, when a space now becoming dedicated to trees. You'll see in the foreground, this is easier for my eye to see because I know the site, but this used to all be trees right here too. And sadly, within the city of Detroit, there's an agreement between the electrical company and the city that if it's city property, the electrical company can cut down trees instead of trimming branches if they're near the electrical lines. Unfortunately, the electric company did not do their due diligence and thought one of our properties was city property when actually we owned it. So we arrived one day to the site to work and had lost 44 trees, which led to, I would say, me not working on the project for a year and a half at least. So this is another key drawing for the project that was recording and archiving the trees that were lost. And it wasn't actually until the pandemic that I started to tend to the site again, kind of heartbroken from that loss. I started to work through just at that moment, trying to see whatever I could grow into the space, with a little bit of twist in mind that if the space had lost its trees and it used to be the sawdust building, the space is now to be dedicated to sort of trees and plant life. So we very simply started with just a real simple growing of vines and hops during the pandemic, where the line work was in part just, out of curiosity and producing something at a moment when we were all figuring out what to produce. But also, as you can see from the image, testing where the light was coming in based on the walls. And so very slowly or quickly, actually, and if anyone's grown hops before, the space started to infill with green and started to actually bring our energy levels back to it in terms of thinking about the relationship to what we could make and what was above, and in essence, sort of growth for the city. And growth for this space, thinking about the hideout now becoming a secret forest. And so it's since moved along now with newer material studies, more plant lives, but I show it now in combination. It's had another twist that I'll share before as I conclude here. While this is all happening, I also started another photographic series that I think was very much so paired with this relationship of trees and their time and building spaces. It's still working out what that photographic study might be called, but I'm currently, because of its kind of, as a kind of injection or injunction, calling it BYE. BYE. This was me actually archiving my parents' house, which my father passed away in and my mom has now moved away from. Working with this in photographs in terms of, in the same way that the darkness has kind of been eclipsing houses, using the trees as a way to remove the sort of sight of the house, something that I actually no longer have access to, and something that has its own sort of form of erasure, but at the same time, enough hints to know that it's somehow still there. And so while doing all of this, literally within the same sort of weeks of that, the sort of major tree, and this is, I'll leave this here as this is our current brainstorm. We had a 80-mile-per-hour windstorm, and we learned that we also have a sinkhole right under the building. And so this tree, which is the grandest of them all in our space, blew over and caught itself on the wall. And it's still very much so alive. And it's still survivable. And so we're actually literally, I'm bringing you this today so those of us maybe having dinner can put our brains together about this, but we're working through the sort of options of tilting it back up, leaving it in its leaning position as it is surviving, or as it being, of course, the sawdust building, figuring out how to sort of use that wood. And so this tree, this has been several weeks now, so I've been living and caretaking for this tree and understanding its sort of presence within this space and what it has done as we certainly try to think through how to advance this very slow motion project that is, I think, in a way, unraveling and telling us everything as we go with it. And so I'll wrap up with this project. I think, this one and sharing the kind of mid-stride for us, I hope gives to the examples of how we really try to tend to a space, let some of the light and darkness lead that sort of way in terms of what might be the things that we can't sit down and imagine on our own, as a way that we can kind of give spaces that are going through a transition or themselves some sort of loss of very different translation into what they could possibly be. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Catie, for the deeply moving and inspiring body of work that you just showed us. So I'll just open up, I guess, with the first question coming from me. What I was really struck by the very beginning, I would say, is just the fact that you said that you draw through materiality. Mm-hmm. I'm asking myself, it was so powerful by your presentation as you really showed us also a body of scales. You also spoke about the quest or the search for imperfection and this new, I would say, ways in which you will allow us to understand what is typically seen as abandoned, right? Mm-hmm. Unexpected, to actually somehow become transformed and beautiful in so many extraordinary ways. So I wonder if you can speak more about the importance of scale and which scale usually for you allows you to discover, I would say, the unexpected or something that, in terms of the limitations of all of the logic techniques that you work throughout your project.
That's such a great question because I align it. It makes me initially think how we used to work very, very small, and in that developed a language of delicacy. And as the work physically scaled up, so even Salvage Landscape, but more so I'm thinking Secret Story, and this one as well. Sorry, Secret Sky, and this one as well. There was a moment of struggling with where scaling up what then became delicate or became ephemeral. So usually, I'd say a lot of it ends up being on a case-by-case situation with the projects, just kind of taking the lead of what might be that which matters. But I'd say that the interest always comes in, our interest with materiality comes not just with what might be the material that's present, but also the process it's going through. And so sometimes the characters or the qualities might be coming out of that tending, or if it's an aggressive maneuver, or the obsessive binding that I talked about. And so the scale is balancing a little bit about the registration of the space, but also in a way the relationship bodily to what can happen to the material. And so I know in my own work, I have very slowly been scaling up because I haven't wanted to jump to an enormous scale and not bring with me a transition across these techniques that I knew I developed when it was much literally smaller work.
I guess that leads me to my next question, which would be related to your examination of also elemental conditions, right? Throughout every project, I heard you say the roof of the wall, but also the politics of those elements, the tectonics and the methods of construction,
yeah.
And also the fact that they are literally related to what the city is doing, that, to actually, I would say, violate and create some pretty haunting and horrible conditions for society. So I'm asking myself, how those elemental types also be used to help you discover the larger whole or larger impact within how zoning regulations are set up, within how you bring also forward, I would say, of the larger injustices in the surroundings. Because even when you spoke about the copper wire, you gave us the larger historical context and why that was important.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can speak a little bit more about how that elemental reconfiguration and how the fact that in your work you consistently push the limits of the information throughout, how those elements you had to navigate through, and also different, like how do you draw an actual drawing?
Yeah.
Into curates process of productive deconstruction.
Yeah, the elemental conditions, I feel, if we state that a lot of our work has light and darkness as the main occupant, the elemental conditions is then when the human comes in, either in reflection of what was there or the desire that the human ideally in kind of maybe solitude, registers their ability to be in the space and maybe what's familiar and unfamiliar about it. So that sort of translation. So I think you're right in terms of thinking about, for me, it's strange how many roadblocks I hit because this project doesn't have a ceiling, and what that means in terms of like inspections and extra meetings and, validating that it's a space and I can't call it a building, but because I can't call it a building, I don't have to do everything that a building has to do. So it becomes a really interesting moment to question or reflect on what might be there, what might be the codes, what might have been its original use, and acknowledge that it's no longer useful that way. And because of that, give it a chance to be something that we would never think of in the first place. There's in essence a little slip or play there that gets to happen that I think cracks open a space that somehow we can relate to, but is very surprising and never would have been that from the beginning. And I think you're right. I haven't thought about it as directly as your question, but the elements become a key moment in tying it back to the observer or the occupant and the city. But maybe aren't always necessarily the primary detail that gets the qualities that come out of the other discoveries. Yeah. Thank you.
We have an eager students and faculty who I know has their own questions, so I'll open it up for everyone.
I have a question, along that conversation about scaling up. There's also, in the last two projects, there's also a reduction of elements.
Mm-hmm.
So while there's definitely your interest in atmospheric, but in the new sky, you can recognize the singularity of the void, which is interesting. And then about this project, there was a moment that I thought only the trees are, like you count the number of trees within the plot. And then there was a moment that you went for a series of rods or threads, and now there's a singularity of a single tree that is coming through.
Yeah.
So along the scaling up, is there a desire of also reducing the multiplicity as a theme work or not?
Well, that's a really insightful question, but some of it I know is answered just by the physicality of scaling up. We are the makers and contractors and constructors of the project, so the millions and thousands of tiny little pieces become a different relationship at a bigger scale that somehow don't feel like they're summing to something that's large enough to hold the space of a whole building. They used to be fragments of the building or within a room or part of a wall. And so I know some of that, and that goes back to the question too, in the slow movement bigger is just the recognition of no longer, I don't want to say the practicality of doing that, because there's also some insanity to doing some of the earlier ones too. But I find that maybe in the bigger works, the singularity that's emerging allows for that entry into a space that then rewards the very close observer all of the much, much smaller details that are cared for in such a way that they become quieted in how long they took, or as you maybe would imagine if you think about the earlier work, there is an not exact, but a careful placement of every single new piece of siding for, how it would align, what color it was, what color is next to what color, which was on the north wall versus the south wall, and which one it would get the light. But that is something that I think is read, and this goes back to the materiality question too, can come out of the shift of the material having gone through a process, and is maybe, my hope is understood in the experience of the space, even though we don't necessarily, one doesn't need to know all the details that I went through to do it. I do think there's something embodied in the work that you can sense that somebody put a lot of time into it, or a lot of care into it, that I think is meant to be there with the occupant.
I guess for me, another part is that you constantly also spoke, I mean, obviously the lecture is titled Architecture and Laws, right? But you're constantly also making us aware of how laws or information actually can be really productive, right?
Right.
Both politically, socially, as well as materially. So I wonder if we can talk a bit more about that balance, because part of it, it just looks, you actually prove to us that reality can become very surreal.
Right.
But at the same time, you're using your work to really reveal something that is rooted within the larger context of that fabric at a different scale. So I'm asking myself how that kind of schism between, are we looking at something that's surreal and tectonically extraordinary in terms of daytime versus nighttime versus its political effect versus the politics of architectonics and how you actually take things together.
Yeah.
And sourcing, for example, where materials come from, who's in control of them, how you reconstruct. But that could also go back to Dima's question in terms of, I wonder if you can talk a bit more about how you choose to edit and select the primary focus of elements, but also primary focus of a key material, right?
Sure.
And its information. For me, it was so powerful when you allowed us to really look at the chart, right? The wood that's burned and now becomes its geometry.
Right.
That friction, I think, is extraordinary in the body of the work that you showed us. And I wonder if you can talk more about how you find those moments where those frictions become even more apparent.
Yeah, that makes sense. Also, in terms of back to the title, the architecture and loss, I think the request for the title came the same day this happened. And so there was a sort of sense of thinking about, the sort of, I don't know, I was thinking like, I was going to talk about this project. Am I still going to talk about this project? And I remember thinking, what has the project gained? What has the project lost? And so that was sort of the pairing in terms of the decision of the title, but knowing that of course is in a lot of the other work. And some of it has to do with thinking about giving an acknowledgement. So a lot of the earlier work was meant to be very ephemeral, and it was meant to also sort of mark a time in work or in spaces that had fallen to neglect, been vandalized, had some form of sort of aggression, either passive or intentional, that was a part of its history in a way, or that it felt like letting these things just sit there was not, or to totally take them down was not a way to kind of acknowledge a moment, make something very unexpected out of it, give it a life that is somehow resonant with what's there, as impactful as the situation may have been, and then to recognize that with that happening, it can then carry on. So there was a sort of holding precious in many definitions of that term, that sort of moment that would come through. And so the work is often simultaneously, there's usually some strange story that leads me to a space. It's often someone asking me to be a part of a space, to tend for that space, or me in this case, for example, taking this one on as a just sort of strange personal interest. Usually what's happening is I'm working with the space and trying to unpack its stories and its details, at the same time recognizing the materials that are either there or can help tell that story. And so the work is recursively back and forth, the building up of this story and the effort of working with the materials to the point of also talking about materiality. And at some moment that conversation comes together where something that I feel needs to be said or recognized, sometimes not always in words, but in either action or aesthetic choice, matches with a process and a material to make something that I think then can acknowledge it. And it's hopefully clear from our work that photography becomes a really important aspect of that. And so in a way for us, it's a sketchbook, it's a documentation, and we truly also acknowledge, especially with some of the work, meaning to just be for a moment and itself lost, that the photograph may have to tell the entire story. And so there's a lot invested in that, and the photograph being able to kind of hold together many parts of the conversation if it's the only thing that's ever seen.
I'm not a question, not a comment, but thank you for your lecture. That was really great. I'm just thinking of your title, and it seems to me it's as much about architecture and care as it is about architecture and cost. And I think you speak a lot about care for the process, care for the building, care for the environment, care for the detail and the craft. And I wonder if you could expand a little bit about what architecture contends with this expanded definition of care, how it has to kind of contend with the norms about inhabitants and occupants and all that. So in your redefinition of care and architecture, as a kind of generator of these projects in your practice, I don't know if you could just reflect on the definition of that word and how it just kind of plays through the ethos of all these projects. Because it seems like it's as much, it's as much about care as it is about cost.
Right, that's a fair read for sure. Yeah, I often talk about the work as tending to the space, tending to what may have happened, even if that is a very intense moment, or tending to the works that we have made. And so I think that there's an interest in sort of what I can do for a space by taking care of it, and also becoming an example of what's there for all of us if we don't care for the space, or that these things aren't something that we make them and then they're just here and they're static. There's so much to their story, so much that I think, similar to the materiality idea, that so much in the process adds so much kind of heart and essence to any one space, that how we are with it just adds so much to that. I don't know, there's kind of a resonance or a feel to that space, to be clear. It's pretty different. I mean, speaking of like tending to a space, like there's a whole project here. I know it's Halloween. Is that someone's costume?
I think we have time for one more question.
There's a whole generation of architects that swerve towards installations as calisthenics for what we consider architecture in a more conventional sense. And then, whatever happens, happens. And then there are those other architects like the Saraceno who escape architecture, if only to practice a more pure form. And I would, I think you're swerving towards that category, but the difference may be that in a strange way, I sense he needs the institution of the museum as a safe space within which to do that, which he doesn't. And you are instead going into the landscape, going into the community, going into decayed space, and going back to his question about care and tending. An idea about architectural restoration, preservation, construct landscapes that are, let's say, a less orthodox interpretation of what we do as architects. So in a strange way, I think this project was very beautiful. We presented it, and then all of a sudden it became transcendent when the tree fell. Maybe.
I don't know what to do now.
So what is the next step for you? And given the degree to which you have self-consciously scripted a practice, how do you scale this up? This is an extension also of Nina's questions about how does this become an expanded architectural practice when it truly scales up?
Right. I appreciate the read of the Saraceno work and resonate with that in terms of the thinking of the feeling like some of the work I'm able to do in spaces that I think are rather unusual to be working in gives me something that I feel is the biggest architectural maneuvers, I've had most success with the maneuvers that I do in these works, as opposed to I feel differently about these than, at the same time I'm working on renovating a motorcycle club right now and doing someone's pilot house in their boat. There's a very different feeling to the work that I think happens in these spaces, that somehow I feel that I'm allowed to do the things that I feel like codes or clients or what one thinks of as conventional doesn't allow for with a fight that I actually feel like I'm never able to win. So the scaling up is something that I feel like is a constant brainstorm that, one also does this with their own money and time, and these projects are very slow because of that. I don't know, I find the scaling up to be trying to figure out a form of practice that allows for doing the work and telling the story and then finding those who want it, as opposed to finding somebody who asked me to do something, if that makes sense. But it's, this is something I want to pick your brain about, of course, because it's not, that definition of practice is not something that's fitting into the things that we know conventionally. And so for it's sort of momentum and, the literal of paying the bills, it's really a kind of difficult jump. But for its ideas and the worth I feel as the work that it can do, it feels absolutely what I should be doing.
So the question of scaling up it's a strange one in the work, actually, because at one level, all the work that you've done and shown tonight is always at full scale, and that full scale of experience, of material, of time, of what it takes to work through a project and have the time to work through a project. And I guess that's the, weird sort of way the question that I keep thinking about is, the language you used often was, this was the moment, right? And I think that takes time and care. It takes practice, but like almost the Allen Iverson version of practice, where you're there and you're working again and again and again on something that is closer to gardening, to cleaning, to preparing, to paying attention to the things that are around you over a long period of time to find that moment. We're often, when what we're tending to is a representation, a drawing, a digital model, a scaled down model, we can't quite attend to those details and those moments that you're able to find here. So it's almost, the question of scaling up is, how do you attend to the things that you need to attend to once you scale down the representation? Scale this the operative mode of your practice. Right. Which is kind of an interesting inversion.
Right.
It's not a question, it's just...
I know. The two drawings I showed tonight are the only two drawings I've ever done. Once I left Nadir's office.
Pretty clever foundation and a documentation of the trees.
That's through the photography.
What's that?
That's through the photography.
Yeah.
And while we're talking about this, or thinking about, I guess, how your body of work is changing, and I don't know if you think of your practice as a body of work where one thing is really building on another, or if it's a practice that takes advantage of a thing that comes your way that was unexpected. But I found myself thinking about how your notion of how we observe your work, or how one who is not the subject of your project, but is the observer of the project, or the how that role has changed. And it seems to me that the barn was the big change for you in that regard, in that what I imagine is that the barn is finished now, and if I wanted to get in a truck to drive out to Michigan, I could go to the barn.
Yes.
Yeah, and how that seemed to be a big change for you in terms of, I guess it's permanent, so its time will be a different duration. It's not going to be a permanent duration. Nobody can buy it, put it in a museum and keep it for 100 years. It will have its whole lifespan. But how has your notion of how others can participate in that project just through simple observation. Like observers that you never know will be there, will go there,
Right.
or interact.
Yeah. I really like the first part of your question, talking about how it was building in the first place, like the practice, because there's another way to do the lecture where I speak of the work chronologically, and interestingly, there's a lot of ties, and I mentioned it, salvage landscape and talking about second story. Not that you're holding all these in your head, but oftentimes something that happens in one project becomes really critical to the next project. Usually it's the sort of unexpected, like a side branch of unexpected that really ends up feeding something that has been observed and still working through. And so that's another version of the lecture, maybe tends to that first part of your comment. In terms of thinking about, so you're right, Secret Sky, when I was asked to do that barn, I jumped at it immediately with the sort of, grappling with questions similar to what we're talking about tonight. If I have a body of work that's installation, that's often meant to be whisked away or very ephemeral, and now I get to do something, I get to do a building. This is, how do I do this? How it was a very critical moment of that, of scaling up. And I think I still held strong to the material of the barn, its sort of life and story, and the effects of the sky, with the acknowledgement of things I had learned from previous installations about the sort of human occupation. And a lot of the details I often choose, are intentionally meant to be, the inside of the barn is just 4 feet wide, so enough to fulfill some of our wider criteria, but also so that it feels very intimate to a person. And the sort of addition of the lights at night to give it a kind of presence that would be, let's say, a lantern or a beacon for someone to passing by to also pull in. Either day usually people drive by and they see this strange light moment, and at night people see this strange light moment and come as well. But I think that one, I was recently asked to consider putting in a long sidewalk through the slice. And I went up there and I pasted out. Yeah, I had the same face that you do. I pasted out. I drew on top of photographs to just try to see what it would look like. And it felt so much that the project was becoming about the human occupant that I eventually had to do just other work to take care. Basically, I had to take care of the ground that over these years has itself, rinsed away, washed away with storms and things like that. And that was a pretty key moment that wasn't that long ago, where it still became the recognition. So back to your question, that I think as much as I'm paying attention to the needs of the human that is the occupant of the space, they're not the primary in the work. And I think that's going to stay to some manner that lets me do these things that are really unexpected.
Not so fast. For the barn, you clad the border of the cut, the diagonal side on the outside. But then on the inside, you go back to the vertical. Why would you do that?
You're talking about that moment covering the door?
Well, look, the cut, if the cut is anything, it's both normal and an aberration.
This is what bothers you, right?
Why doesn't the diagonal fold back into the cut? Because you're not presenting the cut as a fold. Well, you are and you're not. I'm saying if you were presenting it as a folding of the front facade back into the crack, then you would have extended it right onto the side here again. But you were very explicit in giving primacy to the diagonal on the opposite side or on this side. And at what point, why doesn't the interior abide by that same theorem?
So which one is the diagonal?
Yeah.
Which one is the diagonal?
You're talking about this diagonal, or you're talking about the other one?
I'm saying she didn't bring the verticals to here. She let the diagonal of the interior go out. But those are vertical in there.
So vertical to the plan that they're in there. Because you taught me how to turn a corner. It's like the greatest architectural question.
Don't pin it on me.
Do you know how many iterations? So
I'm sure you did, yeah.
there's so many iterations.
Well, if you had done two diagonals, they would have collided in the middle.
Yeah.
If you had done a diagonal on this side turned in,
And then the middle would
the other
be
one on the other side
primary.
turned in, you would have had a collision on the middle, in the middle.
And a total mess. This goes a little bit back to your question too. There's just some, thinking through the careful detailing of how to make it possible and feel like it's part of that. I drew through this one as much as I could on photographs, but it came to a scale that I couldn't treat those things as boards that I could physically move with ease, where this side, which is more of something me standing on scaffolding, the boards are maybe just 10 feet instead of 24 feet. I did it once, I tore it down, I did it again, I tore it down, and the real struggle was actually how to deal with either the overlap or the flush, as opposed to the verticals and diagonals. But I see what you're saying, and we can draw through it together at another moment, but it speaks to your question, because at that moment, I could physically move these and say, no, that's not right, and take them down. But in the front, that meant I had to be on a telehandler or put 6 stories of scaffolding up and have 2 people to hold 24 feet. It just became a different reality and decision. But I like what I came up with.
In the salvage landscape, if I'm not wrong, the main face that you see is the end grain of the burnt elements that are cantilevered back. Is that correct?
Oh, in salvage landscape.
Is that correct?
Exactly. You're seeing the exact same piece of wood.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's an end grain. My comment is really about the ethic behind these kinds of operations. When you are in charge of, you're authoring tectonic grains of some sort, and in that one, there are many contradictions that are coexisting, whereas this one is a consistent narrative through and throughout. And I'm trying to understand, you gave a labor's alibi for the scaffolding and all of that, and that's not persuasive.
You guys now see why I'm called Alibi Studio? Just answer that question right now.
I don't believe in the labor's alibi in this instance. I'm asking for the intellectual alibi for it, which is, I believe, somewhere in your mind engraved in the idea of the tectonic grain, which is why I'm pushing you on the other problem. Anyway.
That's fair. I can see that, because this one, despite being done several years before, really influenced Secret Sky. It feels like a warm-up to that one.
I think that, he wants to jump into this. We're like, so welcome to Cooper.
No, it's great. I
want to say,
anticipated that.
at the scale of where you're working now, what is the distinction between the labor and the intellectual? I mean, are the demands of the labor of constructing something not an intellectual exercise also? It's not an abstraction. It's not graphic. It is about labor at that point.
It's all labor.
Yeah.
It's all labor, what I'm saying. It doesn't excuse us. I mean,
Maybe it goes back to the care question.
All of architecture is incredibly difficult to do and artificial. That's my claim is not that one is easier than the other or one is more possible than the other. It's that it is all artificial. But the brilliance of that piece is she points to the diagonal as having primacy. And then that puts us into the kind of intellectual disarray. If that is on a diagonal, then what do we do next? What's the next step? Michael, you can answer that.
I think that kick of the diagonal means everything in terms of the relationship to the bend of the hammer. And it's that pressure right there to the roof that I think charges that entire roof. I don't know if this is what you were suggesting to do, but to leave the siding vertical and reveal it as a kind of slice would have never done the pressure that kick.
No, I'm in total favor of the diagonal. I think it's the most profound number. I'm wondering what should happen on the inside, because I don't believe the inside should be normal, is what I'm saying. It should be the result of the torture of the outside.
I like the idea that the labor conversation makes me think of the care question too.
Is it true? Because even in the early work, all of the elements of, I felt in the LED projects, or the ones that it seemed to be a complex glass, that they were all carefully, like geometrically designed. So, because there are some atmospheric projects that have been multiple parts, and they are, the individual items are not, they don't matter. The configuration of the individual part doesn't matter. It's about the atmospheric quality and ephemeral quality that is generated. So it's a cloud in the sense of you control, but you don't really shape individual elements. But I thought that's why I don't think the geometry of the void in the singular project is a coincidence. And you control, you have a clear sense of geometry, whether it's a small part or a big part. So this idea that you don't draw and only draw a photograph, or you come to draw.
Draw in space. I feel like I'm drawing in space all the time, with like physically. A lot of the work. I mean, I love your point. Just saying, I draw. A lot of the work in decision making too with some of this, I'm often literally laying out strings or measuring, remeasuring. I feel I often design a lot with kind of density and the geometries that you're mentioning, like great care to where they become occupiable or not, how close it is to you in your body. And that does come with a lot of, I often draw in the space with string to get the right geometry before the sort of infill the density, and that drawing too can lead to some of the very particular geometries that you're noticing.
Thank you so much, Catie.
Yeah, thank you all.